So welcome to New Perspectives, and we thank you for joining us. Today, as many of you know, marks 20 years since the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, the worst terrorist attacks in modern history. So let us observe a few moments of silence in honor of those who lost their lives or were injured in the attacks, their families, and those who worked to rescue survivors. Let us meditate on the future possibility of unity of the human race, not, as Sri Aurobindo says, an outer unity given to domination, repression, competition, and clash, but a true unity based on the highest ideal of mankind that spiritualizes itself and becomes the general inner law of human life. Only then, says Sri Aurobindo, will the possibility of the unity of the human race become a reality. Let us take a few moments in silence. So thank you, and again, welcome to New Perspectives. And our quest to answer the question, can science and spirituality be bridged? New Perspectives hosted Ulrich Mohoff and Linda Lester last July. Ulrich, a physicist and philosopher of science, addressed the topic quantum mechanics and consciousness, referencing his scientific observations and findings on consciousness to the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. The following week, Linda spoke on the union of spirit and matter, in which she presented evidence that the once unbridgeable chasm between spirit and matter indeed is slowly closing. She attributes this to quantum physics, which includes the possibility that consciousness has a part in manifesting reality. Today, we will hear from Marco Masi on the same topic of science and spirituality. Marco will investigate consciousness, mind, and brain from the perspective of modern neuroscience and in relation to the spiritual cosmology of Sri Aurobindo. He will discuss how science is slowly becoming aware that the present materialistic paradigm is increasingly untenable and is discovering what Mother calls the mind in the cells. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko, who will more formally introduce our speaker and open the New Perspective Forum. Vladimir.
Thank you, Rhoda. Thank you. We are very happy to have with us today Dr. Marco Masi, who is a physicist and worked as a scientist in many universities in Italy, France, and Germany. His interests are veered towards new forms of learning, originated from his activity both as a tutor in several universities and as a high school teacher. This led him to author a book on free progress education. I remember when we discussed these issues in the University of Human Unity forum when Marco was visiting Auroville. That was the whole program of education, which is now becoming more and more tangible and possible. He also wrote a 2-volume series on quantum physics entitled Quantum Physics, an Overview of a Weird World. His philosophical interests led him to the vision of Sri Aurobindo and how it could express a future synthesis of knowledge between West and East, science and spirituality, as summarized in his latest book entitled Spirit Calls Nature. This presentation will investigate consciousness, mind, and the brain, showing how science is slowly becoming aware that the present materialistic paradigm is increasingly untenable, and it is discovering that what Mother called the mind in the cells. So, without further ado, I would like to request Dr. Marco Masi to address the audience. Please, Marco.
Thank you very much, Vladimir and Rade, for having me. And let me share, first of all, the screen so we can begin also with the slide share. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And thank you also for giving me the opportunity to speak about a subject, a topic that rarely I have the possibility to speak about, because it relates very distant and seemingly very unrelated topics, namely that of an extreme materialism viewpoint and worldview, and is also a more or less extreme form of spirituality. And you can usually talk with one or the other, and I'm very happy to be in a place where perhaps I can speak about both of these points of view and try to make a sort of synthesis and propose some sort of synthesis of this. In fact, what I would like to speak about today is the question if and how is there a relationship between mind and the brain, our conscious experience, the fact that we have feelings, thoughts, emotions, and that we feel to be a subject because we are and feel to be an individual. And the question is this all philosophers of science would say an epiphenomenon of the brain, just brain chemistry, or is there more? And if there is more, what and in what sense? And I will try to take especially an approach from the point of view of modern science, where especially with the last decade, because you know in the last decade there has been a lot of progress in the field of neuroscience and the use of brain scanning technologies. And the answer to this question from the side of science is quite adamant. They even don't ask the question, they already give you the answer without further thinking. As you know, nowadays you can see in the news everywhere that there is this great emphasis, on the research on the brain activity. Here you can see brain scientists unveil wiring diagram containing hundreds of thousands of cells in a mouse brain, for example. Well, if a mouse brain is, and if and how it is representative of the human brain, that is a question for itself and would need an entire presentation for itself. So it leaves this aside, but just I leave this aside. But what we have today is this great vision of the future inspired by neuroscience, past and present. And a lot of money is given into the research of the brain at a molecular, biological, on the cellular level, and the interconnections of every neurons everywhere. And we hope that we will be able from that to deduce how, not only how our brain works, but where does consciousness emerge? Because that's what modern science posits from the outset. It says there is, in a certain sense, there is nothing like consciousness, mind, that we are sentient beings is just an epiphenomenon of the brain. And it is also all about genetics. You see, these are just titles that I show you of what you can find on peer-reviewed journals on neuroscience, neurogenetics, and human consciousness. Genes and experience shape brain networks of conscious control. And that they tell you that's all about neurons, about genes, about DNA, and not much more than that. And if we want to explain this diagrammatically, we can say it's just their matter, that is a brain, and which is made of neurons, and these by their activity produce consciousness. So you have this vision. This is a kind of vision that modern science has. It is a very extremely materialistic and reductionist point of view. And this led also some people, as this guy that certainly every one of you knows, this is Elon Musk, who hopes to interface our brain to electronic devices and eventually one day upload our mind and our consciousness. By the way, if the mind and consciousness are the same thing is also a question for itself. That's also what I would propose as something as food for thought. But most scientists take this as synonymous. I'm not sure about that. But in any case, they have this idea that you can upload your consciousness, your identity in a computer, and one day then you can download it and have a new body. This is a sort of extreme materialism that also transhumanism has. Transhumanism is a sort of philosophical movement that believes that the future of the evolution of humankind is a sort of hybridization between flesh, between the brain and electronic devices or something like that. And then we will become a sort of Borgs, a la Star Trek, I like to say. That's obviously not every scientist believes that. But I would say that there is a consistent amount of scientists that reason in this way. And the question is beyond this philosophical idea, which one can agree on or not, the question is, does this lead also to a new way of thinking, also at the practical level? Let us see what kind of image emerges in many scientists nowadays. Again, not all, but there is a consistent amount of scientists, and many of those are all quite famous. Like, for example, Richard Dawkins, he says, you're just an egoistic gene. It's all about genes and their molecules and their interaction together. And what we call consciousness, this is feeling to exist, this feeling to have, the fact that we have feelings, emotions, that we are sentient beings and have this subjective feeling of existence. How does this emerge from something that from the outside, from a third person perspective, if you look at it, it's just a bunch of matter that you have in your skull? How can this produce something so intimately understandable only from a first person perspective? And there are these philosophers like Daniel Dennett, who is one of the most famous philosophers in the world nowadays, who says, well, consciousness is just folk psychology. Others, like Kate Frankish, say the belief in phenomenal consciousness is simply a theoretical error. So if you have pleasure and pain, if you have feelings, well, we don't know how this comes up, but it's probably just a theoretical error, a wrong representation of our brain. Susan Blackmore, who is also a quite famous author, and she says free will. By the way, then this also begs a question about if we have free will or if we are just blind automatons, just blind robots, biological robots, or is there more? And they simply say, no, there is no free will, and consciousness is just an illusion. And the self is a complex of memes. Memes are collective ideas. And this is an idea, a concept, mindset, a culture that we have nowadays in large parts of the scientific view about ourselves. But this it reflects also about this idea reflects itself also on a viewpoint, on a vision of the universe as a whole. So if we are just machines, what is the universe? And here, for example, you have Steven Weinberg, who was a physics Nobel Prize, and who said, he just died recently, who said, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. So you are pointless, you are just a sort of biological robot. It's just about a bunch of particles that obey a set of differential equations, not much more. And the universe has no point, it has no purpose, it has no aim. So the question is, does this sort of philosophy stop there? Is it only philosophy, on which you might also disagree? I certainly disagree. But is it only that? Or does this have also practical consequences? Because I think the problem is that when we have a certain culture, when we have a certain mindset, when we see the world in a certain way, we also act correspondingly in a certain way, and also at a very pragmatic level. This conditions our way of doing, our way of forming society, also in politics, in finance, and everywhere, medicine, psychology, and so on. Let me read you an excerpt from Sri Aurobindo, which now I don't see because it is covered by my, so I'm sorry. Let me, because I don't see it.
We can see it.
Yeah, but I cannot read it then, because I would like to read it, because it is very, very interesting what Sri Aurobindo had to say about that. And he interestingly already had this almost prophetic vision where science was going. And he said, the very nature of mind is, according to them, European scientists nowadays, we would say the scientists of the world, a creation of past material experience transmitted by heredity with such persistence that we have grown steadily from the savage with his rudimentary mind to the civilized man of the 20th century. As a natural result of these materialistic theories, science has found it difficult to discover any true physical center for the multifarious true psychical center, not physical, true psychical center for the multifarious phenomena of mind, and has therefore fixed upon the brain, the material organ of thought, as the only real center. From this materialistic philosophy have resulted certain theories very dangerous to the moral future of mankind. It is from these false and dangerous doctrines of materialism, which tend to subvert man's future and hamper his evolution, that yoga gives us a measure and as a means of escape. It asserts, on the contrary, man's freedom from matter and gives him a means of asserting that freedom. When I read this for the first time, where he says dangerous doctrines of materialism which subverts man's future and hamper his evolution, well, I said, yeah, okay, but I found it a bit exaggerated. Nowadays, after having contact and experience in different scientific environments and seeing how these way of thinking conditions our way of doing, and how the way we see the world conditions what we do and how we behave. Now unfortunately, I would say, I have to come to the same conclusion. This is extreme materialism that still dominates large part of academia, hampers the evolution of all humankind. And Sri Aurobindo already talked about this in the Life Divine, where in the first 2 chapters he spoke of the 2 negations: the materialist denial, who said that there is a great illusion, the myth of free will, consciousness and the self, as we have seen, just an illusion. Interestingly, they are also speaking of illusion, but exactly the contrary of the spiritual illusionism. You know that there is also this, not every spiritual tradition is like that, but there are some who say that all matter, all the universe is just the illusion of Maya. It is the veil of avidya. No? And I found it almost a paradox that they have all these 2 extremes have perhaps more in common than what that differentiates itself from each other, I mean. And they come to the conclusion that there is an illusion and they must exclude the other side, because they take one side is matter and that there's only what there exists, and that it must exclude consciousness, spirit, mind, and the rest. And the other side, that everything is only spirit and must exclude, is forced to exclude matter. And I found that very interesting. And they sometimes even use the same vocabulary, illusionism. Huh? But one might say, well, okay, but this is still philosophy, it's mysticism. It's just pseudoscience, woo science, you know. Let's be real, concrete. Okay, let's ground ourselves. It is a fact that there is a correlation, no, isn't it, between the physical state activity of the brain and our neurons and our subjective experience, perceptions, emotions, states of mind, and states of consciousness. The most obvious example, you know, when you drink a little more or less amount of alcohol, the tiny little alcohol molecule that goes into your blood flow and goes into your brain conditions your state of consciousness, and you feel somehow differently, isn't it? So let's face it, that's materialism. If you take psychedelic drugs, you can have intensive subjective effects, and they modify something in the neurotransmission of your brain by the dopamine transmitter, inhibiting more or less it. If you have a brain damage or brain tumor or Alzheimer, which is a modification of your brain, this can lead to severe cognitive impairments. A good example of this is also that if you have damage on the Broca area, if it is disrupted, if it is injured, you may lose the ability to speak. Interestingly, what people normally omit when they come to that point, that interestingly, you lose the ability to speak, but you still have a perfect ability to understand language. So you cannot express language, but you continue to understand perfectly language. And how this is speed. So there are 2 different centers of the brain for the understanding and the speaking. This is interesting in itself, I would say. And let's face it, when you have negative emotions, or not only negative, whatever kind of emotions like fear, anxiety, stress, there are some parts of your brain that light up. In this case, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, which are in the center of your brain. And as people know who got surgery, when you get a shot of anesthesia, well, people say one loses consciousness. Do we really lose consciousness? I'm not sure about that, because we can only say that we don't remember where we were when we were under anesthesia. But at any rate, that's so it's a fact. So science wins, materialism is true, or the rest is an illusion, isn't it? Let me take up this and let us speak a bit about how we think about the things that we observe in our life, and how scientists think when they observe facts. There's a so-called causation correlation fallacy. which has this form that if from some event A follows always B, then A must be the cause of B. In our case, it's if from the brain's neural activity follows a conscious experience, then the brain is the cause of conscious experience, isn't it? It seems an obvious logical consequence, a causation correlation. But that this can be quite well a fallacy. It can be shown by very simple and very trivial examples. For example, the correlation between sunglasses sold and ice cream sales. If you see that people wear more sunglasses and that correlates with the sale of ice creams, do we have to conclude therefore that wearing sunglasses makes people more willing to buy ice creams? Well, you obviously understand that's obviously not the case, because it's a very obvious causation correlation fallacy. It's the real cause is the sun, or the heat, if you wish, that leads us to wear sunglasses and buy ice cream, not or vice versa, if you prefer. But the causation has a completely different correlation. I make another example which is relevant to our topic here, the correlation between water pipe switch and water flow. You know, if you can regulate the water pipe switch, you have more or less flow of water. Does this imply that water pipes produce water? Nobody would think in that way. But in what sense is the way of thinking of the modern materialistic, physicalist, neuroscientific point of view different? There were only few people who considered this another possibility and who were aware of the fact that there might be this fallacy. And this was, for example, William James, who was a famous psychologist of the last century, or beginning of the last century, and who said the following. So here again, I don't know why I get this overlap here, but I must go back here. My thesis is now this, that when we think of the law that thought is a function of the brain, we are not required to think of a productive function only. We are entitled also to consider permissive or transmissive function. And the ordinary psychophysiologist leaves this out of his account. His analogy was a bit more elegant than mine, not the water pipe, but the light prism. He said, take a light beam, a white light beam, it goes through a glass white prism, through an optical prism, and divides the colors. If you impair or modify the glass prism, also only its orientation, the colors are modified as well, or eventually disappear. But this does not imply that the glass prism produces the light beam, isn't it? So, similar idea came from Aldous Huxley, who, by the way, I'm not sure about that. Eventually, Vladimir can correct me later. Huxley and Sri Aurobindo were in contact, or at least they were. They knew each other, and because I know that they cited each other. But at any rate, Huxley said, to make survival possible biologically, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. So what was for Huxley mind at large? It is what we in the more spiritual yogic nomenclature call cosmic mind. And he had this idea that the brain does not produce mind, it funnels through this cosmic mind. And it is a sort of reducing valve, like the water pipe. Okay, so let's see what Sri Aurobindo had to say on this. And he said, consciousness depends on the body and its functionings, on the brain's nerves, gland action, right physiological working for its own firm state and action. It uses them as its instruments, and if they are injured or unable to act, the action of the consciousness may also be in part or whole impaired, impeded, or suspended. But this does not prove that the action of consciousness is an action of the body and nothing else. There is an instrumentation, and if the instrument is impaired, the user of the instrument can no longer manifest himself rightly through it. If it is destroyed, he cannot operate any longer unless or until he can get another instrument. You can find, Aurobindo was never so prolific on this topic, but you can find hints of that throughout all his writings. For example, he also still has a Life Divine. The brain is not the creator of thought, but itself the creation, the instrument, and here a necessary convenience of the cosmic mind. So here he connects to Huxley, or perhaps Huxley connected to Sri Aurobindo. That's probably more probable. Our physical organism no more causes or explains thought and consciousness than the construction of an engine causes or explains the motive power of steam or electricity. The force is anterior, not the physical instrument. Think of, for example, of electricity that goes through a conductor. If you modify the conductor, also the flow of electricity changes, but this does not show that the electricity is produced by the conductor. Think of a light bulb, for example, the filament. That's the same thing. I put also this diagram here just to remind you how also in the classical yoga there is the position of the seventh chakra, the Sahasrara chakra, is always in all traditions is placed above the head, not in the head. It's also, Sri Aurobindo talks of higher levels of consciousness above the head, not in the head. So it cannot be the brain. So the brain must be in this idea of this philosophy. If it is a philosophy, I leave it to you. In this philosophy, it is the brain that is an instrument or as a channel, if you prefer. And he speaks also of the overmind poetry, by the way. But you will say again, okay, but it's again philosophy, mysticism. I'm a realist, I'm a materialist, I believe only in science. Okay, so let's see what science says about these things, because the problem is also if everything is produced by the brain, what happens if I split your brain in two parts? You might think this is a sort of Frankenstein novel anecdote, but that's not. It is a real surgical intervention that has been done several times on people who suffer of extreme seizures or epileptic seizures. And as a last resort, there is this possibility to cut through the corpus callosum, and which impedes these seizures. And the question is, well, try to do that with the motherboard of your computer. Cut it in two and you will see what happens. Does our brain die? Do we die? No, we not only don't die, but substantially, yes, these people have then some problems. They have the problem to coordinate the left and right side of their body. But overall, there is no self-splitting. There is no splitting of consciousness. There are not two subjects. There is not a divided perception. There is a divided perception, but an undivided consciousness remains intact. So this is a little interesting fact, scientific fact, that you can, what I cite you comes only from peer-reviewed articles in mainstream journals, no paranormal stuff. And how can this be if the subjectivity is created only by the brain? So just food for thought. There are people who have only half of the brain, like this. This is done, this so-called hemispherectomy is done on children when they are very young for the same reasons that I said before. And when they have these extreme forms of seizures, and due to neuroplasticity, they can recover. But there is no half individuality. They live quite well with only half of the brain. What about this person here? Okay, here on the right side, you see a brain scan of a normal person. Here, this on the left side, I don't see if you see the pointer, but on the left side here, you have the brain scan of someone who had about only 25% of the brain. And this was a normal man who had a job, had a family, who had a relatively normal life. And the only reason why they found this out is that he had some walking issues with walking. And only for that reason they discovered that this person with almost no brain continued to have a normal life. So how can this be? This is perhaps the most extreme case of the so-called congenitally decorticated children. You can see they have here only the brainstem and a little slab of the prefrontal cortex. And in this case, we are not speaking anymore of children having a normal state of consciousness. Of course, we are speaking of unfortunate beings living in a sort of vegetative state. But nevertheless, when they receive loving care from their parents or from their careholders, yet a subjective experience and awareness of the environment and the self could be awakened. Auditory perception and visual awareness could be awakened. And this without a visual cortex, by the way, because the visual cortex is positioned here in the backside of your skull. Track faces and toys, they could recognize faces, listen to music, smile and cry, and at least in one case, at least according to the research of Dr. Shibmon, a clear indication of self-recognition in a mirror. So the question is the following. At some point, some researchers came to the question, is your brain really necessary? Of course, I'm not claiming that the brain isn't necessary. If I cut out your brain, you die on the spot. And there's no doubt about that. But it is not clear what the brain does really. And it is far from being obvious that brain produces or creates consciousness, as neuroscientists say. That we don't know for real, despite all seeming evidence to the contrary, which is based on a causation correlation fallacy. We can find also counter evidence, as I showed you. And the interesting fact that most of the what happens in our brain is correlates with motor-sensory functions, that is very material things, seeing and material perceptions, seeing, hearing, touch, taste, smell, and homeostasis, which means regulation of your body functions, balance, movement, coordination. There are, of course, also correlations with higher cognitive functions, but not so much after all, if we think that this must be a tremendously complex task to perform by a material object, these higher cognitive functions. So some people now, in the last decades, 10 or 20 years, came to the conclusion or framed the question the other way around. May it be that consciousness is fundamental, or the mind, or this ability to cognize, cognition, is not necessarily, or not only at least, a brain epiphenomenon, but is something inherent in the universe, in matter, in life. And when they took this viewpoint, they found that it is possible, or what they say, the word mind is a bit, maybe too much. I don't like the word mind in the context of plants and cells. I don't think that plants have a mind in this human sense, of course. But people speak of so-called basal cognition, something very primitive and elementary form of cognition that does not require a brain. And here you see some, they found that the plants can have a sort of basic intelligence, and there have been a lot of experiments in this sense. Due to time constraints, I will skip this part on the plants, but I invite you to look for basal cognition, Google for that, on plants, or plant intelligence, plant cognition, mind of plants, and you will see that there is a lot of research that has come up in the last 10, 20 years about this subject, and that has shown that some primary forms of cognition do not need a brain. But so let's come to the point where we ask the question, then if this is so, perhaps also cells, we go down and down and down in the hierarchy, and we ask if also a single cell might express some form of mentality. And the typical example that you might have also read recently in the last years is that of the slime mold. The slime mold is this sort of blob, no? But in reality, it is not a pluricellular organism, but it is a unique, single, gigantic cell. And if you place it in a maze, it can find the shortest path in the maze connecting two agar spots, that is, two places of food. It first expands throughout all the maze, then retracts itself, and by the way, it recognizes also itself on the corners, and then leaves only itself, distributes itself only along the shortest path. An interesting example of, well, more or less primitive intelligence. We thought that this is only mice can do that, but mice have mice can do that, but mice has a brain. Here you have not only an organism without a brain, but only one cell. What about bacteria? Bacteria can navigate inside it also a tree-like fractal maze. These are real experiments. Here you can also find the references in case you wonder, is this as pseudoscience or not? They have been published in journals like Nature, which are one of the most prestigious journals of nowadays in science. And these bacteria sense the environment, actively move within it, target food, avoid toxic substances, and meaningfully change their swimming direction. The most interesting thing, I would say, they come together and form a bacterial collaborative communities with a collective intelligence for problem-solving abilities to achieve a common goal. For example, you can see that on one side of the maze, the few bacteria find food, and somehow, we don't know, they are able to communicate it to the bacteria on the other side of the maze, and then all the collective, the community retracts from one side of the maze to the other where the food is. And there are a lot of other examples one can make to show this sort of intelligence. The sort of intelligence of a single cell that has been discovered, by the way, rediscovered a century later, which is quite interesting because we already knew this. No, I don't know if it's a century, but it was already in the beginnings of this last century. There were some people who said this already, but nobody took this seriously. Why? Well, it depends from your worldview. if you have a certain worldview, you'd simply ignore simple facts. This has changed, fortunately, recently. In 2019, someone repeated some experiments with this. Well, you see, this is a bit strange cell. It has this trumpet-like form, this Stentor and it is a single-celled organism that attaches on a hard basis, a rock, for example, or some solid, and rests there. But if you perturb it with some powder or some toxic substance, it gets irritated, and the first thing that it does, it bends away. Okay, and if for some while, by bending away, it perceives, somehow feels that this is not the solution, that this toxic substance is still irritating it, then it begins to flatter its cilias. Cilias are little organelles, filamentary organelles attached to the surface of the cell membrane. And by flattering it, it hopes to sweep aside this toxic substance. If it discovers that even this did not help, then it takes another strategy and contracts. And if still this third strategy did not work, it detaches and swims away. This is a behavior that psychologists know very well. It's called the hierarchy of responses to repeated stimulations. That it means that you are confronted with a problem, and by a trial and error approach, you try to solve the problem. If you see that it doesn't work, you try another approach, and so on until you find the solution. It was believed that this could be done only by a brain, and now we see that it can be done even by a single cell, not even a pluricellular organism, but by a single cell. So, okay, here also mushroom cognition, also mushrooms. That's very, very recent. About that, I knew much less. That I discovered more recently this, but it seems that also mushrooms have this ability. They are able to learn, and they possess short-term memory, and they are able to learn from experience. And they don't repeat certain patterns of behavior if they have seen that this pattern of behavior did not give a certain result, expected result. As if something is, I don't say thinking, because again, this may be a bit too big word, but there is something cognizing, so to speak. Can we go even further down into the inner parts of the cell? Yes, we can. It turns out, this is very, very recent, this is of this year, this is a research of this year. It turns out that even mitochondria are the organelles inside the cell, and they are responsible for the production of energy. When you eat food, you have to transform it in energy, and that's what mitochondria do, but they are inside the cell. So we are speaking of something which is still smaller than a single cell itself. And it turns out here that I'm just citing what they wrote in this article, like ants in a colony, they collaborate, form groups, divide up tasks, and synchronize their activities, form networks, merge together, and split to share chemical signals, proteins, and genetic code, and so on. So what this seems to suggest is that the deeper we look down into the microcosm, and still there a sort of mentality of some sort of mind is still at work somehow. Obviously, again, not a human mind, of course, but something that has this basal cognition. And that's why nowadays so we come to the other side of academia, who is now it's still a minority, but there is now a slow change in awareness with regards to these things. You can see these sort of publications. All living cells are cognitive, state some scientists. Biology transcends the limits of computation, and they speak of basal cognitions. And plants are intelligence. Here's how. This is also an article of Monica Galliano. By the way, she is very famous in this field. So, does this not remind us of something that Sri Aurobindo told us already, I would say, 100 years ago? But he came to this conclusion not certainly by a logical, philosophical, or scientific investigation, but a quite very different form of investigation, a spiritual, yogic, inner investigations. And he wrote a lot about of that, and who knows integral yoga, you know that in the Mother's Agenda, you have thousands of pages about this topic. And in Savitri, I like these verses. In our body cells, there sits a hidden power that sees the unseen and plans eternity. Our body cells must hold the immortal's flame. Almighty powers are shut in nature's cells. And yes, the question now is also, this was a microcosm. Could this go also from the other way around? Because we saw this in the microcosm. Does this tell us perhaps something also about the macrocosm, the universal consciousness? Well, the Eastern philosophies were quite clear about that. We know that, no? But the Western philosophers were quite skeptic about that. Yeah? But now you see things are changing. Also, the Western philosophers of mind, still a minority, but growing minority, speak of this cosmopsychism. They begin to accept that the other possibility, that of Huxley, William James, and finally Aurobindo, even though these people don't know nothing about Aurobindo, they read, however, James and Huxley, and they begin to postulate also the other possibility, that maybe mind, consciousness, is fundamental, not an epiphenomenon of matter. And some come up with old theories which were quite present in the philosophy, Western philosophy, which is panpsychism, the doctrine or belief that everything material, however small, has an element of individual consciousness, a psyche. And these are quite famous philosophers, not just someone. So from this point of view, where we say matter produces consciousness, we can perhaps also postulate, and I hope that I have given you some very scientific, down-to-earth food for thought to think or postulate that perhaps it goes also the other way around, that it's consciousness that uses brains, cells, and comes through or shines through, or whatever you would like to express it. Let me conclude with this citation of Mother, because then all this leads us to the question, what kind of science are we going towards? And a science that seems to hint to the possibility that we can bring together an extreme form of materialism with an extreme form of spiritualism and go beyond that, perhaps one day. We are still not there. And Mother said, I think that this possibility of science, pushed to its extreme limits, joining up with true knowledge, and this impossibility of any true conscious connection with the material world are both incorrect. There is something else. The point where the two paths, the materialist and spiritualist, and merge into a third that would be the true thing. An objective scientific knowledge pushed to its extreme limits would certainly bring you to the threshold. That's what Sri Aurobindo means. And here we are coming to the threshold, I think, with his scientific discoveries. But he also says it's fatal because all those who went in for that knowledge believed in it as an absolute truth, thus closing the door to the other approach. In this respect, it is fatal. That we saw at the beginning, where the materialist thinks that matter is the absolute truth and closes the doors to the spiritualist approach. And the spiritual approach, believes that this is the absolute approach and closes the door to the material universe. And she says, even accepting and uniting them both, spiritual and material knowledge, won't solve the problem. Something else is needed, a third position that isn't the result of these two, but something still to be discovered, which will probably open the doors to a total knowledge. This third position, I see very often people speaking of spiritual science. Well, I do this also, by the way. But she said that it is not by uniting them that we can create the spiritual science. We have to find a third position that contains them as two complements, but it is not by summing them together. And that's what I have tried to do also in my recent book. If you want to have more information of this kind of topics, and here in this book I go into these matters much more deeper into the details. And I speak about this idea that could one day lead us to an integral science, which connects consciousness with matter, and spirituality with science, spirit with nature, and also the Eastern and Western philosophies. I don't claim to have found a solution in this sense, not at all, but it might sound a bit arrogant perhaps, but maybe it is. But I think I have shown a first step in a possible direction to this third position, where I show from where we are now, in what direction can we go to find for this third position that Mother spoke about. And I think I have done this. And you can find this on Amazon. Here you can find it on Amazon. You find the most recent edition of the book. You can find it also elsewhere, but here. Okay, that's all. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Marco. It was wonderful. We have several questions here already posted by people, 6 of them. So if you don't mind, I will read some of them to you. So we can start the questions and answers session.
And maybe on screen share also, if you could, Marco.
Yes.
I limited the screen. Stop here. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Great, that we can see you better. So there are several questions from Alok Mohanty. Do you see the non-local behavior observed in physics has a correlation in biology that proves the primacy of consciousness?
Yeah, even if we would show that there is, supposedly, this is actually a conjecture that is out there, actually, and that in our brain, there are maybe it is conditioned by quantum phenomena. Even if that would be true, what does this really prove? I am not sure that this proves that the consciousness is something immaterial. It would prove that consciousness has a quantum origin. On the other side, yes, I say that this is just a speculation. don't take these theories. Roger Penrose, for example, the recent Nobel Prize for Physics, is one of the most he advocates for this theory. And I would say, yes, consider this theories open-minded, but don't take this theories as the last proof of whatever. My feeling, my personal feeling, it's only a personal feeling, I have no proof for that, that yes, there is a correlation between quantum physics, non-locality, these weird things that we can see in the quantum world with the superposition, and this holistic aspect of quantum mechanics has a lot of analogies with our mind's functionings. For example, how we see the world, we see it all at once in one semantic whole. And these mechanisms, in a certain sense, for me, are reminiscent of quantum physics. So I believe, yes, it might have to do something with that. But I have no strong opinions on that. And more than anything else, if quantum mechanics has something to do with it, I think it has more to do with this mind at large, this cosmic consciousness that expresses itself through a quantum universal field. And we know that this exists because quantum field theory is about a quantum universal field. Yeah.
There is another question from the same gentleman. From one end of spectrum, we call physical consciousness pranic consciousness or mental consciousness. That means consciousness expresses through the instrumentality of certain medium capable of certain behavior. Can the consciousness prepare its own medium of instruments or instruments?
This is a damn good question. Yeah. Yeah, that's a big mystery, because I think if what all the, I would not say only yogis, but all the mystics, West and East, if what they say is true, then the answer must be inevitably yes. Then at least consciousness must be at least partially be able to prepare its own medium or instruments. Otherwise, how could life emerge? If not by thinking that we fall back in the purely physicalist, monist materialism form of purely mechanistic universe. But if the universe is not just mechanistic, then I think the key is that consciousness is in fact able to, and Sri Aurobindo writes, in my book I also write about this, also if it's speculative, I must admit, and that Sri Aurobindo writes on this in Life Divine, where he says that this consciousness, this cosmic minds, forms by associations and by relations between different objects, points, particles, something, and brings into existence and forms the first cell, I suppose. He didn't say this in that way, but that's my extrapolation, and formed the first cell. In fact, how the first biological cell formed is still something light years away, it seems. So far, we have no idea, no clue how this could be, only from a purely mechanistic point of view. But this brings us then in the minefield of the intelligent design. Are we supporting here an intelligent design idea? This needs another session for that. Can I respond to this of Salil Gupta?
Yeah, sure.
What evidence can you give us to the ordinary consciousness is not an epiphenomenon? So I hope, I don't know at what time he posted this. I hope that I have
at the beginning. At the beginning.
At the very beginning, yeah. Okay. I hope that I have given you not a proof, because everyone who says I prove you at this stage, from a scientific point of view, the mystic can prove it to one. As a mystic, you can prove it to yourself. Then that there is a consciousness in the universe becomes a self-evident fact that does not need a scientific proof. But from a scientific point of view, everyone that says this has been proven, be skeptic of these people. Because I don't think that is. But I hope that I have given you some suggestion, some food for thought that might suggest that things can be seen also the other way around. So then there's a very long question.
Would you like me to read it out, because others may also hear it? Marco, regarding the instrumentation question, I've always liked the analogy of the radio or television receiver. The musical or soap opera performance is not created by the receiving instrument. It derives from a distant but present source. And yet, young children can be forgiven for assuming that their favorite TV characters live inside the screen.
Exactly. Perfect summary of that aspect that I gave. In fact, it is also used as a radio metaphor, it is called. There are a lot of metaphors that make clear even this. It's not necessary to believe that it is so. What, however, is important that one sees the correlation causation fallacy in taking only one approach. And these metaphors quite vividly exemplify, because if I break a radio and something in a radio is reading the news, the poor guy who is reading the news is not dying because I smash the radio. Yeah, but that's the way. Well, dying biologically, if I smash your brain, you die biologically for sure. But this correlation causation, that mind is just a projection of the brain. Why? Because you see that if you smash your brain, you lose consciousness. How do you know? I hear very often also psychologists and others saying that when you sleep, you lose consciousness. So first of all, when I dream, when I am a dream state, I am in other sort of consciousness. Yes, it's very different from the waking state, but there is still some subject having an experience. And even if there is no remembrance, we had no dreams, who knows? Maybe you don't remember. So let's not jump to the conclusions.
Definitely. After death, there is another question. After death, whether consciousness continues to exist for some time with its individual characteristic?
Well, you will know when you will die. I don't want to go so far in claiming, because what I wanted to do here is just to instill some doubt to this narrative that now modern neuroscience have definitely shown that consciousness does not exist, free will does not exist, and mind is just production of your brain. You are just a blind mechanical robot. There's nothing else. You don't find scientists saying it so bluntly. But many scientists, it's what more or less implicitly they mean, and they think so. So, and I hope that I have given you some, and there are also a lot of other things that from the scientific point of view that we can add. For example, does the number of neurons determine the level of consciousness? But there are animals who have 3 times as neurons as we have. An elephant, for example. And so all these scientific analogies to show something that we must be careful of how we think about things, also from the scientific point of view before. And from there, to tell you what will happen after death, I would not like to go so far. I only say there are good reasons to believe, and also scientific reasons, that if mind and consciousness are not an epiphenomenon of the brain, that when your brain dies, that your mind and your consciousness does not die.
Thank you. There's another question. Can you please throw light on how do positive and negative emotions such as happiness, discontentment or depression, affection, neutral activity, quantitatively and qualitatively? Yes.
Yes, this is a famous placebo or nocebo effect. How our state of being, mental and psychological being, expresses itself also physically. This might also give a partial answer to the previous question, if consciousness can, I don't remember now, prepare our physical state. Of course, it is now a scientific fact accepted by, I think, almost every physician, that our psychological state is reflected in the bodily state. But here again, the question is, who is the cause, and what is the cause and what is the effect? Is a physical state of well-being, does this lead you to a psychological well-being, or is it the other way around, or both? And I think that here we also could give a lot of interesting, for example, just yesterday I saw someone who has made a research just only by psychotherapy is more effective than chemotherapy in curing cancer. And why don't we try this out more frequently? Why doesn't the official science, official medicine, doesn't take this seriously? Well, there might be also a monetary, financial interest behind that, because, but I don't think that's the only reason. It's also this mindset that we are just robots, and that our psychological, well, yeah, you know, this placebo effect and nocebo effect, but so what? Let's do it, go back to business as usual. But if we change our way of seeing, that's what I said at the beginning, the way with which you see the world and yourself and the people and what you are, determines also the way you make research and what you accept from the results of this research. I found this quite impressive, that 12 sessions of psychotherapy help you more than chemotherapy if you have cancer.
Incredible. And this placebo effect is also a very paradox, because they speak about effect, but placebo effect, that means there is an effect of consciousness influencing the situation.
Absolutely,
And there is another question from Alok here. Subject-object division will endlessly express itself through numerous ideation as we see around us. Can it be possible to see consciousness and matter as one in time and beyond time?
Yeah. Yes. No, I don't want to. Here you see, it is a very vast subject. It is difficult to summarize an answer beyond a slogan. It's very difficult. Because let's say that we see things from a certain level of consciousness, a mental level of consciousness, where this subject-object division is almost unavoidable. But if you rise, you can read this in Life Divine and the Synthesis of Yoga and all the writings of Sri Aurobindo. This subject-object division begins to fade away, and in the supramental knowledge, the division itself is meaningless. There's a passage where he says it is an unbearable violence for the supermind, or something like that. I don't remember the exact words. For the supermind to see any separation, meaning also the subject-object separation. And by the way, also the time, the temporal separation. In this higher levels of consciousness, you live in the Trikala Drishti vision of time, where past, present, and future are one. So let's turn back to the mental level. Someone who hears this from in our ordinary state of consciousness says that's just a wordplay, isn't it? So it's
or it may open up him to some kind of higher perception.
Exactly, and that's why we are here.
Right. Push him towards that higher kind of, yes.
But I discuss this also in my book extensively, step by step. It's a long journey, 540 pages. So you begin from where we started today, and you end with this time vision and the subject-object division.
It's a wonderful answer you gave on this oneness of consciousness and power, or being and consciousness. They are one in the highest sense. Yes. There is another question here. Is there any research on how do chantings of mantras affect our brain cells?
Yes, I have heard about that, but I know that there is, but I must confess I didn't look up this much. There is for sure such an effect, but if you Google on Google Scholar is not the Google normal search engine. It is a search engine of Google who looks up the research papers, and you try mantra, these keywords, mantra, chanting, and state of the brain, etc., and well-being. You will find certainly a lot, of course.
So there's another question. How do you see the relation between mind and spirit? Is in some way the mind using every cell that can reach in the body?
I'm not sure if,
I mean, it's not very clear, the question, yes. But the mind and spirit relations, because mind and body is another kind of relation, so gradual relations.
And the problem in the speech, especially in the Western philosophers of mind, they conflate the words as mind, consciousness, spirit, if they are dualists, spirit, all in one. They take this as synonymous. There's not, as in this spiritual cosmology of integral yoga, you have it. There is a distinct, even if they are very connected and interrelated with each other, but they are the planes of being. Matter is one thing, mind is another thing, consciousness is again another. At the highest level, we can say that they are all the expression of consciousness. But here again, let's from the mental point of view, I think it would be better not to confuse mind with consciousness. For example, let me make a very first person exercise where you know that you have thoughts. Thoughts come and go, and it's so difficult to keep under control our restless mind. But the subject which might be only the ego, or is it more than the ego? Well, that's another question. But let's say the subject that experiences and is a witness of these thoughts that come and go, does not come and go. So there is ontologically a difference between thoughts and the witness. So to conflate them together has led the modern philosophy of mind to such confusion that they are still struggling with it. But yes, I favor this subdivision, even though at the end of the story, all is the divine in a certain sense.
By the way, Sri Aurobindo addresses this also issue with in his meditation, especially in these conversations with Pavitra. You will find this, that Pavitra observes his thoughts, and he says, Sri Aurobindo, that the first stage would be the separation, the split in the mind, that the passive part of the mind starts observing the thoughts. And that's maybe the confusion which was taken by philosophers, because they came to that stage. But he says it is the first stage. Then you will notice that behind that passively kind of processing mind, there is a deeper consciousness standing, which allows this split, actually. And that is something, yes, which one has to look into. And there is the last question for today. In what way can we humans possibly influence the mind of cells? Are we given something to do that?
Try to speak with your body, I would say. Speak with your body. You have an ailment, and say, step back and say, why do you make this mess? Please, I have more interesting things to do in my life. Please heal, or especially don't get the sickness. And try this out. It's just even that is a first person experience. It's not necessary always to have the scientific proof. That's also a problem of our society, that now they are trying to show the most obvious things, and that must be proven scientifically. Try this out by yourself, and then you will not need any proof. And if you speak with your body, with language, with words in your mother tongue, there will be a change that you will be not aware immediately, but maybe 24 hours later, you say, "Oh, this ailment, this pain, where is it gone?" That's the mind of the cells. Because body consciousness more generally.
Thank you, Marco. It was wonderful. It was really beautiful. And there are very good responses already from people. They are very thankful for your presentation.
No, but also interesting questions also. Yeah, I appreciated that. And okay, thank you very much, Rade and Vladimir. It was a pleasure.
And I would also just like to thank you personally, Marco, for staying with us and seeing that we answered just as many questions as possible. And we'd just like to make 2 quick announcements before people leave us. We are not through with our journey here on science versus spirituality. We are going to continue to host other speakers that have very, very interesting and deep insights, such as Marco. Next Saturday, September 18th, we will host Shadalu Ranade, and he will speak to this notion of an integral approach to science that Marco refers to. And he sees it as a first entry into an integral approach to science through this exploration that he's going to do in the technological area and its implications. And he believes this will give us a glimpse of the extraordinary potential of such a science holds for the future of humanity. So he's going to be coming into it through more of a technological or a perspective on technology and where that leads us. And then tomorrow night, we hope you can join us. We are going to be doing a panel discussion on compassion for oneself and others, which is obviously a topic particularly relevant this weekend on 9/11, but also at all times. And it is 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, so those joining us from India, we apologize. But we do record all these webinars, and they are available on our website. So again, I just thank you so very much again, Marco. I thank the attendees for joining us and for your wonderful questions.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Namaste.
you.
Namaste.